conscious inclusion, and we'll also be touching on identity politics. But before we dive in, I think it's really important for us to all share with everybody who we are, how we self-identify, so that they are at least aware of our positionality and how our identities inform our conversation today. So I will start us off by introducing myself as Dylan. My pronouns are he, him, or she, her. I self-identify as a South African, white, gender fluid gay man who is an immigrant and privileged to have been university educated and have English as my native language. If I may put you on the spot, Sehan.
Yes. Hi, good morning to everyone in Europe and evening to those who are dialing in from Asia. My name is Sihan and my pronouns are she, her. I am based here in Singapore and I'm working for Japan Airlines in the Global Customer Experience and Marketing Division. I oversee some activities, marketing activities in Southeast Asia, India, and Australia. And I'm really thankful for the opportunity to join the panel today, actually, to learn from all the other speakers. And I'm very humbled to be able to share from my perspective, somebody who's not in the field of de&i, but just, from day-to-day experience. So very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sehan. How about yourself, Sophia?
Thank you, Dylan. And great to meet you all. My name is Sophia Hussein Parker. I identify as she, her. I am Inclusion, Equity and Diversity Director at one of the world's largest global advertising and marketing creative services agencies, Wunderman Thompson. I have been in the advertising industry for the last 2 decades, and I've been very much connected to the conversation of diversity, equity and inclusion in the last 5 to 6 years. Before that, my experience was very much based on the business commercial side. I also, similar to Dylan, feel very privileged to operate from a place of knowing what I know, and a lot of my work is centered around amplifying voices of the underrepresented and marginalized groups. And over to you, Mandeep.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. My name is Mandeep Rupra, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Head of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Citizens Advice, which is a UK national organisation with 200 local offices that gives confidential information and advice on a range of areas. I'm also a trustee of the National Mental Health Charity Mind, and I co-chair their Race Equity Committee. In terms of my background, I've been working in D&I for over 20 years, but what I always say is that, in terms of my positionality, I'm a second generation South Asian woman, brown woman, and I'm a product of hope, of resistance, collectivism, and tenacity, and that really informs the work and the way that I work and do this work. So yeah, thank you everyone for making the time to listen to us today.
I love that. Thank you so much, everybody. And I think I will come to you first, Sophia, to launch us into this discussion. And I guess my first question to you is, could you maybe share with us a moment which you remember experiencing being marginalized or excluded or othered or even silenced for that matter? And what did you learn from that moment?
Thank you for your question, Dylan. It's quite a reflective one. So I'm going to speak on both based on my experience and experiences of women who I have had the privilege to work with, and women who have shared their stories with me on a very personal level. And I want to refer or reference one such conversation that I had with a senior leader who was critical in the pitch process. In fact, she was leading the pitch. And suddenly she finds herself unaware of the last minute requests that were made by the client to the agency in terms of delivering the creative work. So not only is she caught unaware, but by not having access to this information meant that a multi-million-pound pitch would have been lost. if we as an agency hadn't responded to those insights. So upon doing her research, and whilst fully believing she had lost handle on the pitch, which we women often do, is internalize and ready to take on blame, she realizes that it wasn't actually her who overlooked the information, but in fact she had completely been dropped off the email exchange between the senior most creative leader, the managing director, the agency, and the client. And all this happened because she was a woman and the men wanted to have the conversation offline, right? So yes, it's in the nonverbal cues, and yes, it's in the overt behaviors of, of exclusion, in the absence of being consciously inclusive, which often ends up meaning that women are constantly being silent and othered. Listening to that and listening to this story, you might think, well, that's not Sophia's story. But actually, there is a part of me in there. And I think there's a part of every woman in there, because this is the reality that women face on a day-to-day basis. So it's so critical that we as women and men as allies learn to champion and advocate of all historically marginalized groups. Because if we hold ourselves accountable, then there is hope for that kind of collective change and hope that Mandy talked about right at the start. So yeah, I leaned in on a story that it's very personal to me, because actually it's in the day-to-day behaviors. Being a woman of a South Asian heritage, being a woman who holds her identity so strong in terms of having a headscarf on, it's not an alien thing that happens where the visibility does drop off.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I think, while that story, as you say, may not have been speaking to a personal experience of yours, it resonates for so many women, right? Wherever you may find yourself. And that's the power of telling these kinds of stories. And I think, it really is those everyday behaviors that we have to, especially, and I speak from myself here as a man, it really does require that level of conscious inclusion, right? Because there's these everyday behaviors that are just kind of considered to be the norm, right? And there often isn't any bad intention. It's just, this is the way we do things around here, or this is the way we're used to doing things around. And it really is kind of just growing that self-awareness, right? So thank you so much. Mandeep, was there a thought or a personal experience you would like to share with us?
Yeah, this question was really interesting, because it really made me reflect that there hasn't been a time where I haven't felt othered. And if I think about the first ever time, it was when I was a little girl. And it's important to, and I'll explain why I think that's important to share, because as a small girl, I knew who I was as a brown little girl that wasn't valued. The moment I stepped out of the home and at school, and being bilingual, and how that was viewed by the school at the time. And although I didn't know this at the time, I was very much, now in hindsight, I knew I was grappling with feeling not belonging. And that's also because I was explicitly told I didn't belong in the country, which was very confusing as a young girl, and very destabilizing. But it really hugely impacted how I navigate the world. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about this, and I know we're talking about gender equity and we're talking about the workplace, but marginalized girls become marginalized women. And that's because of how sexism and patriarchy operates. So for me, I think it's really important to really be cognizant, if we're thinking about creating change, is that marginalization continues throughout life. It doesn't start when we enter the workplace. So when our outside experiences impact our feelings of comfort, of safety, of well-being. So when we're thinking about the workplace, for me, it's really important that we see people as whole, and they come with a range of experiences, and they're part of societal structures of marginalization, and that we want to create spaces where we're not having to leave parts of our identities at the door. So I just really wanted to talk about, we often talk about EDI in the workplace or D&I in the workplace, but it's just D&I generally, in my view. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We live our lives, we inhabit our own worlds, and depending on where we find ourselves, we can't just leave parts of that at the door, or, oh, we'll select these parts to take these in with us, right? We should have that safety, right, to feel as though we can bring our whole self. So thank you. That's incredibly powerful. And Sehan, did you want to maybe share your experience?
Yes, thank you. And actually, just listening to everybody, and you mentioned about needing that safety. I find myself really privileged and fortunate that I was born and raised in Singapore, and I think throughout my education here and my life here, I've not really had to face such issues. I don't really recall at any point in time in their growing up years such incidents. But I do recall when I moved to Japan from Singapore. This was for work back in 2008. When I left. When I left Singapore, I went to Japan to work. For the first couple of weeks, I was actually left out of my weekly team meetings. And this was like a small team of about 7 of us, myself included. And I was the only foreigner on the team. I was the only woman, and I was youngest at that time. And the thing is, I did not speak much Japanese at all. So after a few weeks of feeling like I was kind of lagging behind on information because I wasn't, getting the updates or all of it, I decided to invite myself to the meeting. And so one day, while it was going on, I kind of knocked and asked to sit in. And so it was interesting because I remember not only were they not upset with me for barging into the meeting, they were actually pleasantly surprised. And what may have seemed like an act of kind of ostracizing me was actually them being very considerate for me and my time, because they knew I didn't really fully understand Japanese or speak it. So they actually had a colleague to update me, all the key points that I needed to work on, for the week after the meeting. But it wasn't to purposely make me feel excluded. And so, yeah, it was my psyche at that point in time too, when I entered the meeting room, was not one of anger or like a sense of injustice, but like my motivation was simply to see if I can do a better job, if I can just get more up to date with what's happening. And I was learning the language at that time, so I could pick up on like dates and certain events, like keywords and names, which I'll jot down and follow up later on. But yeah, so I think Dylan mentioned just now that like the intention behind certain actions sometimes is not one of ill intent. And had I not like had the courage to just enter the room at that point in time, I think I wouldn't have found out. And when they learned what I was trying to do, I mean, they were really, really appreciative of the effort that I was putting in to assimilate into like my new surroundings. And from then on, like that day on, it was just I was in every team meeting, and not just that, all the team gatherings outside of work as well. We formed a really tight relationship despite our differences, and it was a really great start to my assignment to Tokyo, which lasted for almost 10 years after that. So it was a very interesting memory for me. And I think my takeaway from it was really, not to assume the worst of the situation at the start. And a lot of times it comes from the self, like to have that courage to do something about it if we feel that there's something not right. And here for me, the focus was actually the work on hand. Like I needed to know the information to do my job. So it was more of an objective view. And yeah, I think it really helped to build that camaraderie, because then, we give them the opportunity to dispel any biases if there were any to begin with. I don't really know. But yeah, I think that was a very interesting experience for me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Sehan, your point speaks to Ratika Wadwa's point in the earlier panel, where it really is about having that courage, which is not easy, right? To step up and go and ask that question, right? Or invite yourself to that meeting. And then it comes to that question of practicing the reciprocal empathy, right? Understanding that actually neither you nor the team that you had just been introduced to had any ill intent. It was just perhaps a lack of understanding or a miscommunication in each of your positions, right? And so, thank you for sharing that example, and thank you so much, Sophia and Mandeep, for sharing your stories with us all, because I think they beg the question, and this is a question that I put to all of you. Then, what needs to change in our organizations or our communities so that women don't have to experience these kinds of encounters that we've spoken to and just described? And perhaps I can come to you first, Mandeep.
Big question. I'll think about the workplace rather than communities, because I think it's a different type of lens on that. But I think for real change in terms of gender equity, I think we need to really recognize the diversity of women first. Often, particularly when I think about how long I've been doing this work, often when it was about gender equality, it was always about white women. And that's how it was thought about. But actually, women, we're not a homogenous group. And we have to understand the diversity and the intersecting oppressions within that. Like, a Black non-disabled woman will face a very different experience to a white disabled woman. And what does that look like? So there isn't a one size fits all. And I think that's a really important piece when we say, there are nuances in terms of experiences, and in terms of, and that really influences our journeys. Like I said, for me, my experience really impacted how I experienced the workplace. And so for me, it's really important that within workplaces, we talk about equity in addition to equality. And why I think that's really important is because we need to understand the systemic barriers that are happening in the workplace. I was reading a piece of research from the States, and that talking about how women, it's not due to a lack of ambition or wanting to progress why people like women aren't CEOs. So I think it's really important. So what is it? It's the systemic barriers. How are organizations structured? What's talent pipeline processes? Are they inclusive? Are they equitable? And I think that's really important, that we don't solely take a deficit fixing approach. I think you're absolutely right. It is, you have courage, you speak up, you say, and our voices should be centered. But it's not just my job as a woman to do that in the workplace. It's the organization and the leader's role to have a collective responsibility around that. So for me, I always start when I work in organizations in terms of really building their understanding of D&I and building their collective responsibility. Because if you don't do that and you just have things like a women's leadership course, or tell women to lean in more, which was the narrative around 15 years ago, if you lean in, that will be fine. I don't think that's true, because if you look like me, the issue isn't leaning in. I can't get in the room. I'm happy to lean in once I'm in the room. I just can't get in the room. So how do we make sure we're looking at those systemic issues, and how do we get organizations to have a collective responsibility around any equity area, but in terms of gender equity, and how do we all understand allyship as well? And Sophia talked about that in terms of the importance of men, our non-binary colleagues as well in this space. I could say more, but I'll stop.
No, thank you so much. And I see, Sophia, you took yourself off mute. Is that because you wanted to kind of offer some comments and input to Mandeep?
Just to build on from what Mandeep said, yes to every single word. And I wish you would carry on talking, because I think it's very powerful what the messaging behind that. I was, just having a quick look, as it was International Day, Women's Day yesterday, and it's Women's History Month this month. The data is always very revealing and very grounding, and makes you very humble as well. And also angers you and gives you that kind of opportunity to say, if not now, when are we going to change? So There's still 113 countries in the world that do not have laws to ensure equal pay for equal work for men and women, right? So that's just unacceptable. There's 400 countries that make certain jobs completely off limit for women till date. 29 countries restrict the hours women can work. And the one that really got to me was 18 countries allow men to make the decision whether their wives can be working or not. And, you know, the data doesn't lie. And it's about, to Mandeep's point, it's about looking at the systemic barriers that impact women in the workplace, and actually how the macro trends, cultural norms reflect when we come into the organization, because we are one. And when we are encouraging authenticity and that connection between who we are, bringing our best version of ourselves to work, and those conditions of psychological safety and belonging, we can't be ignorant of the macro societal pressures and trends that play a part in the woman when she does enter the workplace. So it is the systemic, it is the structural, it's the institutional, and yes, it is the behavioral as well. How inclusive are we when the woman does enter the workplace? What is her access to progression look like? Is it of equal value to the man? Once again, I can keep on talking, so I'm going to mute myself.
Well, thank you both. And I think the point, if I understand your contributions to our discussion correctly, the challenge really is to move from self to systems, right? That systemic approach, understanding that, yes, as individuals, we do have, of course, responsibilities. We acknowledge that. However, our responsibility also lies in changing, redesigning, rebuilding our systems, which clearly are not working for everybody, particularly women with marginalized identities, and indeed others, any person with marginalized identities. And it's about that systemic change that's where the real hard work needs to take place. And that is work that a lot of people bulk at, right? Because that's where it gets tough. That's where you feel the bite of it. So yeah, I think there's a lot to reflect on there. So thank you so much both. Sehan, I'd like to move over to you. And I'd like for us to touch upon this notion of culture fit, right? So many of you will be familiar with Madison Butler. And Madison argues that the idea of culture fit is a lie we tell ourselves to defend our biases. And that really hit home for me. So I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And there's also, of course, this pervasive notion of what professional looks like, right? And many now argue or agree that it is a racist, sexist, ableist standard, right? This idea of profession that has been invented. So, Sehan, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on culture fit, on this the standard of profession, and what do we need to do to make sure our policy and our practice, right, in our organizations don't fall into these traps of culture fit and professionalism.
Thank you, Dylan. I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but I think what Madison Butler might be arguing against is the use of culture fit as an excuse to be selective, in the process of hiring. So like based on visible traits like race or gender or age. And to this, I would, agree with her 100%. I think it's a really feeble attempt at hiding, away biases that are the true reasons for why, some of these hiring processes are taking place. But I do feel it is also kind of how I say, scapegoating this culture a little bit, because culture should really not just be about how one looks. It's not about whether you're young or old, Chinese or Japanese, man or woman, but it's about the more intangible things. So things like attitude, work ethics, diligence, your values. I think those in that regard, people who share similarities in those regards form a culture. And sometimes, I think it's quite natural to have, and it's healthy if it's a positive culture at the workplace. So, I think it's important for a company to hold itself and therefore its employees to certain standards in these regards that I just mentioned, like attitude, work ethics, and values. And I don't think it's about having a culture just for the sake of forcing people to comply or fit in, but like-minded people would naturally kind of gravitate towards each other and form this culture, and it's good if it's a healthy one. So I'm not sure, like, in terms of getting rid of such policies, is important in that sense, because I do feel like there are people who thrive in competitive, just for an example, like thrive in competitive work culture, and there are some people who don't, and it's perfectly fine either ways. It's just that we both need to understand what is required and apply to what you think you would be the best fit for, and you would lessen the pain, I suppose, of how do I say, like being in a place that you don't like. If you would be motivated by such a culture or demoralized by such a culture, it would be important to understand that beforehand. And then I think it will also save the companies, a lot of cost in recruitment, in not having the right match of fit. And I think diversity, even if we look at organizations, like there's so many different types of organizations with different corporate cultures. And so, I don't know, I think it's fine for there to be a way that, a company operates. And when they are interviewing, to make known what those, cultures are. But the important thing here is not to use culture as an excuse, because if you are blatantly actually choosing people by how they look or whatever other differences it is, don't use culture, because it's such a I say waste, as in, because culture is important in it, in some aspects. And yeah, that's how I feel about this.
Thank you, Sehan. It's not about weaponizing culture, right? And I mean, just a question reflecting on what you've just said, Sehan, perhaps to you, Sophia or Mandeep. Do you think it is possible, right, to eliminate this excuse of, oh, you're not the right culture fit in our practice, right? Or do you think it's just a lofty ideal where we're being too idealistic? Because it's all very well, right, to have a written policy, which I'm sure most companies, if not everyone, right, has strict criteria that let's say in the recruitment department or function, follow. But in reality, right, that is still being used, that culture fit. So is this a lofty ideal, or is it something that can actually take place?
I'll talk to it, Mandy, but please join in. Or if you have something more intelligent to say than I do, I'll base it on my experience. I think that it is always risky to refer to culture without knowing what you're referencing, right? So culture is non-tangible, but culture reflects in how we engage with our employees. It's not in, someone said it's not in whether you are recruiting, attracting the right people, but it's about whether you're retaining the people that represent all elements of diversity across all levels. So it is in some ways disrupting those kind of ingrained norms and behaviors that we have in our practices and policies at the organizational level. It's about challenging our biases on a regular basis. It is in form of some structured programming that talk about culture and in a way that becomes, translates in a way in the organization that people know. When we say culture, what do we mean? When we say, values, what do we mean? And it's just about breaking those languages down so there is clarity and transparency and openness and honestness in everything. So yes, it has to reflect in the policies, but it has to reflect in the day-to-day behaviors and how they manifest themselves from the decision-making point of view as well.
Thank you, Sophia. Mandeep, would you like to add a comment?
Yeah, I think when we talk about culture fit, is code for keeping the status quo. It's not about actual how do we develop culture. So I think it's code for something else when we talk about that. More of the same, whatever that might be in that geographical area, that organization. If it was 20 years ago, it was very much white, cis, straight men, and that's what the culture fit was, and a particular way of leadership, and that's what it meant. But I think that the really important point here is that the culture piece is really important because it's what type of culture you're trying to create in an organization. And actually, if you have the right culture, it creates belonging. We want to embrace diversity. We want to create a space and a culture and modes of behavior where staff don't feel they have to assimilate and everyone's willing to learn. And that leads to increased well-being, increased retention. So there's so much in terms of culture to help belonging. But I do think the culture fit piece is, like I said, an excuse. But I think there's also something around marginalized women. And I'll talk about that from this because of the context of the conference. That when you're marginalized and you're in the culture of wherever you might be in organization or country, you do have to think about the cost of bringing your whole self to work. And do you have to assimilate or do you have to code switch? I've had to, who I am now to who I was at the beginning of my career was very different. I've had to work very hard to stand in my truth and be authentic and true to who I am, rather than try and make everyone feel comfortable with who I am. And I say, so yeah, there's a lot. I know that just wasn't a thought. You asked me for one thought, but yeah, I think culture is super important for this work.
Absolutely. And, just keep talking, everybody. This is just such a wonderful, nourishing, enriching conversation. And I wish I had the opportunity to start taking down notes. But we actually have had a question come in from Silvana Barbali. And her question is, I really appreciate how you are talking about culture as not homogenous. Are there any ways we can help recruiters or interview panels to balance the importance of culture without hiring people who are a culture fit? So are there any ways we can help recruiters or interview panels to balance the importance of culture without hiring people who are a culture fit? I don't know who would like to tackle that question.
I guess there's two things. If it's recruiters that are external, it's like, how do you choose your recruiters? How do you assess them? How do they understand D&I and what you're looking for? So I think there's a piece there. But if they're internal recruiting managers, for me, it feeds into that bigger understanding of what D&I means. And actually, competency is not bound by identity. So if you're that look a particular way, it means X. And it's like, how do we train recruiters or our recruiting managers to be really proficient in recruiting and understanding the value of diversity isn't just about representation. This is what I always say. When we talk about diversity, it's not just about someone who's Black or disabled. It's actually diverse. It's who they are with and being values based, because we are not all the same. So, you know, I think it's about understanding all of that and actually understanding your organization's culture. So for me, you know, it's really important we try and create quite expansive and inclusive cultures where we welcome difference, where we welcome dissent. It's okay not to agree with what is happening, and we center those voices. And I think if you start creating that narrative, then for recruiters internally, they're able to identify that in a candidate and go, actually, they're like nobody else in the team. That's fantastic, because that will bring diversity of thought. It will bring challenge and innovation and creativity. So I think it's it's like the training that you give, and it's how we talk about candidates as well.
Thank you, Mandeep. And, you know, to your point, our identities as individuals are not to be treated as if they're a pick and mix, right? Oh, well, we don't have one of you, we don't have you either, so we'll take this and, you know, out with the rest, as long as the representation is there. I think that's a really, really important point. So thank you. Sehan spoke to values, and obviously that's kind of bubbled up throughout the course of our conversation. So Sophia, if I could come to you, in terms of, you know, value alignment, it's clear that that's now become a priority, right, for many people. You know, the last 2 years of us surviving this pandemic really has forced many of us to kind of take stock of where we're at, and we're looking for that value alignment. So how can we, as leaders, as organizations, navigate this effectively and successfully?
Oh, great question. Thank you for asking. I'd love to know the answer to this to myself, but I'll start with sharing some of my thoughts. I guess, yes, it goes without saying, value alignment essentially is the glue, right, to performance excellence in organizations. So yes, it is a priority, it should be a priority, and yet we're finding that 1 in 7, there's a research by the Kantar Global World Federation of Advertisers did in collaboration with, and they found that 1 in 7 of us from an industry, creative advertising, marketing industry point of view, would consider leaving the industry if there was a lack of commitment to D&I, and that includes the value metric as well. So it makes it a tricky one, right? Because we need to go above and beyond the performative kind of initiatives and support when it comes to all things I&D. And it's so much deeper because we have to work hard at getting it right, whilst also accepting and acknowledging that values are actually a deeply personal thing. And sometimes they're hard to put in words. So therefore, we have to help our employees as organizations identify what shape their values look like when they are in the workplace. So this can be done through, be it structured training programs or through sharing, from a wide organization point of view, sharing the organizational values and purpose. And applying the inclusion lens, it's about creating conditions, and we've talked about it already, conditions where you feel you belong, where there is psychological safety, where you feel you are in a space which is healthy and has been created for you, where courageous conversations are encouraged, and both your values and the work, the contribution you're making in the work can coexist, in synergy. It's a bit of a business terminology there, which I try to avoid using, but I think it just works here. So, value alignment, I think everyone else has talked about, the fellow panelist, about it's not, it's about that boosting that morale. It's about heightening engagement. It's about increasing retention rates. It's about lowering, sickness, absenteeism. It's about overall well-being of our employees. And it does wonders as a consequence of all, if you get this right, it does wonders for the employer brands too, which as organization, let's face it, we spend so much time, effort, resources building up our employer brand. So, and by tying in our employees' personal goals into professional goals, I think that is also another great moment for organizations to recognize how that value alignment can happen effectively. It gives the employees the ownership and clarity of what they can, as an employee, expect from you as an organization, and what the organization and your line managers in return expect from you in terms of performance and loyalty. And all this feeds into the value alignment in a way that I think is more sustainable longer term and effective and meaningful, as opposed to my initial point of it being one-off or a performative gesture.
Thank you, Sophia. Just a wealth of reflective work to be done there. So thank you so much. Sehan or Mandeep, would you like to respond? Maybe share reflections. If not, that's okay too. I didn't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think if I can just add, I think what Sophia mentioned just now was really true in terms of like being able to articulate, and you mentioned breaking down the definitions and the meaning of values, because it can be quite vague and there are many interpretations of that. So I think for companies and brands, like, it's really important to be clear and to communicate very clearly about its identity, what it stands for, and what values are important to it as an organization, and be authentic and attract the right people or the like-minded people to continue on building this organization. So, like, if I were to take an example, like at GEL, we have something called the GEL Philosophy book, which is kind of a collection of like 40 over topics or tenets of philosophies, with which we try to align ourselves to. It's a wide range of topics that could be in terms of how your attitude towards work. It could be about cooperation with colleagues. So we kind of go through that quite frequently, and use that as a way to align the vectors among the employees. And so there are actually a lot of these that I resonate, that resonates with me, or that I resonate with. So, for example, we have topics like making decisions based on doing what is right as a human being. Not as a man, not as a woman, but as a human being. Have a beautiful mind, be thankful. So things like that, and it's created a kind of work environment that I want to be in, and it's the kind of people that I want to work with as well. And so I do think having conversations with like a basis for discussion is also really healthy, because then people can share how they interpret these different things, and how their experiences, how they can apply these to their day-to-day work and experiences. So I think that does help make the communication within the organization better as well. Yeah.
I love that, a philosophy handbook. And was it was that co-created with people from across the organization, or was it more leadership top-down approach to creating that philosophy handbook?
It's a combination of both. So the initiative and the trigger was the leadership, and it was created by our ex-chairman, Dr. Inamori. And it was then in conversation with all the different departments that make up the organization. And in an airline, we've got so many different divisions, the front lines, the back end, the maintenance. And so in conversation with all of these different departments, find these topics that would be relevant regardless of which department you're in. Maybe some more than the others, but still across the board. And it's very like one of the topics is to align our mental vectors. So this really does help gel, I think, the company together.
Thank you, Sehan, for sharing that great example, practical example. Mandeep, was there something that you would like to add before we move on? Perfect. So actually, I'm coming to you, Mandeep, for the next question. So that worked out quite well. The topic of identity politics. This is a big one. And I appreciate you may not be able to answer it in 5 minutes, but last year, many of us read that companies such as Basecamp and Coinbase, they attempted to ban all societal, political discussions at work, right? They just said, you're at work. This is not the place to discuss what's going on outside of these four walls, as it were. And after those announcements were made and those policy changes made, a third of Basecamp's employees quit on the spot, right? So I guess my question to you is, do identity politics have a place in our workspaces?
Such a good question. And I'll try and be succinct. So I think there's two things here. I think the term identity politics has become weaponized, and I think it's very value laden, and it's seen as something problematic and something used to shut down conversations around inequity and what is happening, because they probably make people in the majority feel quite uncomfortable and don't know what to say. So I think it's been used as a term to silence. I'm absolutely not surprised that a third of staff would want to leave, because it comes back to my original point about not wanting to leave your identity at the door, because the personal is the political. I can't separate. It's when people say to me, even, do you think about yourself as a woman or someone who's Asian? And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. I think of myself as an Asian woman. That nothing is separate. We bring our whole selves to work. And I think it is really important to be aware of that. And I was even, we're in the Great Resignation since the pandemic. And I was reading an article, and a researcher was showing, candidates have an option of applying in so many places, but one of the things that they do look for, does this organization take D&I seriously? Can I bring my whole self to work? Will we talk about the politics of what is happening? And lots of organizations, tried to do that when with George Floyd's murder and the other murders that we're aware of in the US and the BLM movement. So for me, I think it's really important to say, if you're marginalized, you can't be non-political, because just the very fact our identities are politicized. So for me, I would say you can't have it both ways. You can't say we take those things seriously, but we don't want to talk about them in the workplace. Yes, we want representation, but please don't talk about your experiences of being from whatever those diverse backgrounds are. So I think that's really important. And an example of how we, for example, in our organization, because I take that really seriously, we take a social justice approach to D&I. Whatever is happening outside we will reflect that internally, and we're very aware of that, and we look at it from a systemic point of view. So when there are things externally, and I'll give some examples, for example, the murder, when there was lots in the news around gender-based violence and murder of Sarah Everard in the UK and Sabina Nessa, and there was other women, we spoke about that. Within the organization, we guided managers on how to have those conversations if people were feeling impacted by that. Very much the same when George Floyd's murder, and with the racism within, I always forget because I don't watch football that closely. I think it was the Euro semi-finals where there was lots of racism towards the England players. And I put some guidance out to our leadership group of, actually, we know this will be people have come to work knowing that's happened, having probably been watching the match, seeing the racism, having to leave pubs or wherever they were watching it early for their safety, and then having to come to work and acting like nothing happened. So for me, it is important that we think about identities. And what I did is I put a note for our leadership group, like, acknowledge it. These are the ways to have conversations if people want to. We don't want to force people, because sometimes you want to come to work and not have to think about all those things. And, you know, leaders really like took that on board, and it really led to conversations around race, around racism. In the case of Sarah Everard, it was around sexism. And we got feedback that staff of colour were saying what a difference it made to them, that their managers were having those conversations, that they felt really valued, they felt seen. So for me, that's why probably a third of those staff left, because they want to work somewhere where they're seen. And if it's like when people say they're colorblind, for example, and I don't see color, everybody is the same. Or I don't see X because everybody is the same. There's one race, there's a human race, which is a lovely idea, but we don't live in that world. And I always say, if you don't see my gender, you don't see my race, you don't see me, and you don't understand my experiences. So yeah, I've probably spoken far too long, but yeah, it's I think it's really important to talk about these things within the workplace.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. You know, so much of everything you said there. Yeah, it's just it's so vital, right? And I think, you know, speaking to your point, to the social justice approach, I think in many ways we can see that playing out now with the Ukraine conflict, right? 2 years ago, I don't, and I personally don't believe that the likes of Apple, McDonald's, Starbucks, and all the other huge global brands, right, that we're reading of each time we get a BBC notification or wherever your news source is, that they're pulling out of Russia, right? It's just incredible to see how different things look even 2 years after. And it's really, you know, it's not just about mission statements, right, coming out and statements of solidarity, but you see a gradual evolution of big brands that really can make a difference or make an impact just because of their sheer size and access to resources. They're now actually translating their words into actions, which is, I think, you know, with all its imperfections, is a step at least in the right direction. So thank you so much. I just want to highlight a couple of comments that have come into the chat, and then I'd like us to kind of finish off just on a couple of thoughts and reflections. So Vidu, forgive me if I mispronounced your name, Vidu, but he says, I work in an executive search firm who are proud of their work on diversity, but pushing ourselves to continuously A, be aware of our own biases, and B, pushing internal panels to do the same. Like much of what has been said today, it is an ongoing thing. Tracy Young has said, another great panel discussion. Thank you so much, everybody. The difference between culture fit and culture contribution are so often overlooked and ignored. So it's great to hear all of you acknowledging the importance of valuing difference, including diversity of thought. And apologies, Vidu is a she, not a he. That is my mistake. Apologies for that, Vidu. So we have about 5 minutes left of our panel. And I guess this is where I come to each of you, and maybe I'll start with you, Sehan, is what idea, reflection, or question, or challenge even, would you like to leave our delegates with today?
Okay, thank you, Dylan. I think at the core of it, I think we should be striving for equality, not just across gender, but, every other differences such as race and nationality. In the first team the team in Japan that I mentioned I was part of in the initial answer that I gave, I was different in so many ways, in gender, age, nationality, but does not mean that we cannot share the same culture. In fact, I felt really connected with my colleagues at GEL because I feel like we share similar attitudes and values, which are espoused in the GEL philosophy I mentioned. So I hope we can kind of keep an eye out for, more instances of which there are a lot of great things and attributes that we share in spite of our differences. And maybe in terms of like the focus on occurrences of discrimination, maybe how should I say, policing that is not really the only way to kind of spread the idea of equality all around. And I think in the first session, Terry mentioned something about sympathizers and boosters. I think as an individual, like what we can do within the realm of our circle, given the different roles that we play in the organization and in our communities, I guess I would want to personally shift from shift from sympathizing to more boosting, and to try and be that ally for the women in my circle, for people who maybe have done something great but are too shy to take credit for. And how do we elevate them, by just giving them a little nudge or making people like recognize that? Or if they were feeling down, how do we create an environment that's conducive for more sharing? I think those are within reach in terms of what we can do individually. And so we may all be like a drop in the ocean, but together we can be that wave to overcome. And so I don't belong to any D&I field, and so I currently speak to that level. So it's really on a day-to-day basis what I feel like I can do on a personal level. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sehan. And you're absolutely right. You don't have to be within the D&I space or realm, right? It's just showing up to do better and be better as a human. So thank you so much. Sophia, how about yourself?
I've got a few things. I'm going to just leave just with one. It's about, if you're not part of the change, the solution, then you're part of the problem. So it's about holding everyone, each one of us accountable, doing that check-in to make sure how is it we are being active in the roles of our lives. So collectively coming to the change, shifting the narrative, that transformation change that we're looking for.
Thank you, Sophia. And how about you, Mandeep?
Yeah, I'm just going to say I completely agree with that point around collective responsibility. But I think what I want to talk about is we often talk about creating safe spaces to speak about D&I, but I always push my leadership to talk about safe and brave spaces, actually, because D&I can feel very uncomfortable, depending on the topic of what it is. So we should embrace that discomfort. It's part of the work. I always say, if you're not uncomfortable, you're probably not doing it right, because we do have to push ourselves in this work. So for me, it is about creating spaces where we're challenging ourselves to grow, to be humble about what we do know, what we don't know, and really taking account of people's different experiences. So I would really say, like, push yourselves out of the comfort zone to really think about what you need to do and be aware of what you don't know.
And as you say, to learn from that discomfort, right? It's one thing just to feel uncomfortable, okay, but what next? How do we translate again that
absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sehan, Sophia, and Mandeep, for just a mind-blowing conversation, really. There's no other way to describe it from where I'm sitting. So thank you so much for your time. That brings us to the end of our panel. We are going into a 10-minute networking break, which gives you the opportunity to connect and engage with other delegates. And we will see you at 12:55 for our next panel, the Real Model panel, moderated by Tim Hardy-Lennox from CSG. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care and stay safe. Bye for now.
Thank you.